What's the scariest situation you ever found yourself in? My friend Julianne called me and said her husband Chet would be gone for 2 hours, and she needed my help getting her and the kids out. It was the call I'd been waiting for ever since I found out what Chet was doing to her. She'd already tried leaving twice, but he'd found her both times, and the second time he'd broken her ribs. When I arrived, my heart was already pounding. She was throwing clothes into garbage bags with shaking hands while her kids, 7-year-old Mila and 5-year-old Oliver, kept asking why they had to pack so fast. Julianne told them they were going on a surprise vacation, but Mila kept saying Daddy would be mad if they left without telling him, and my heart broke hearing how scared she already was of him. Julianne explained Chet had hidden trackers in the kids' toys and backpacks, so we had to leave everything behind. The paranoia of it made me sick, imagining him secretly sewing trackers into his own children's belongings while they slept. Mila started screaming that she needed her stuffed rabbit and wouldn't leave without it. We were losing time, and I kept checking my phone obsessively, terrified Chet would come home early like he sometimes did to catch Julianne doing something wrong. Julianne's hands were shaking so bad she dropped an entire bag down the stairs and had to repack everything while I watched the driveway, my heart racing at every passing car. Mila had hidden in her closet with her rabbit, refusing to come out, saying Daddy would be sad if they left. Julianne had to physically carry her out while she kicked and screamed, and I felt sick, but also remembered when Julianne had called me crying, because Chet had held a knife to her throat for talking back. We were loading the bags into my car when Julianne's phone buzzed, and her face went white looking at it. Chet had texted that he'd be home in 10 minutes and asked why she hadn't answered his last 3 calls. My whole body went cold, and Julianne started hyperventilating and saying we had to go back inside and unpack everything because if Chet saw the packed bags, he'd kill her, and he meant it literally. My hands were shaking as we dragged everything back inside, and Julianne started frantically putting clothes back in drawers while I returned documents to the filing cabinet, trying to remember exactly how they'd been arranged. The kids were confused, and Mila kept asking if the vacation was canceled, while we desperately tried to make the house look normal. Julianne shoved the garbage bags under the bed and was putting the kids' toys back when we heard Chet's car in the driveway, the engine revving aggressively like he always did. My blood turned to ice, and Julianne grabbed the kids and told them not to say anything about packing, but Oliver didn't understand and kept asking about the surprise vacation. Chet's key turned in the lock, and he slammed the door open so hard it hit the wall, and I thought I might throw up as Julianne positioned herself in the kitchen while I sat with the kids, my hands trembling. Chet walked in and immediately started examining everything, running his finger along surfaces checking for dust, opening cabinets, like he was looking for evidence. He looked at Julianne and asked why she was sweating, why the kids looked upset, and when she said they'd just been playing, he grabbed her chin and forced her to look at him, saying he could smell lies. Chet walked through the house opening every door, every drawer, and I could see him cataloging everything that was slightly off. He asked Mila what was wrong, and when she didn't answer immediately, he raised his voice and made her flinch. Chet's voice got harder and he grabbed Mila's shoulders, kneeling to her level, and I saw Julianne tense like she was preparing to intervene even though it would mean getting hit. He said lying to Daddy was very bad and squeezed Mila's shoulders until she whimpered. Oliver piped up that it was a packing game, but Julianne quickly said they'd been pretending to pack for a pretend vacation. Chet's face went dark, and he stood up fast, making everyone flinch, then walked to their bedroom. I heard him tearing through closets, throwing things, and suddenly he yelled that he'd found something. He came back holding one of the garbage bags we'd missed, clothes spilling out, and his face was purple with rage. He threw the bag at Julianne, hitting her in the face, and asked what the hell this was. She tried to explain, but he grabbed her by the hair and dragged her toward the bedroom while she cried out in pain. I stood up to help, but he pointed at me and said if I moved, he'd make sure I never walked again. The kids were crying and he turned on them, telling them to shut up or he'd give them something to really cry about. He asked why I was there, said he knew I'd been helping Julianne with her little plans, and walked over to me close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath from lunch. He noticed my car keys and grabbed them from my hand, then went outside to check my car. He came back holding one of Oliver's toys we'd forgotten in my back seat, and his face was terrifying. He walked up to Julianne and backhanded her so hard she fell, then asked Mila directly if Mommy had tried to take them somewhere. Mila was sobbing and shaking, looking between her parents, and Chet grabbed her arm and shook her, saying she better tell the truth or else. Mila's lip trembled and she looked at her mom on the floor with blood running from her nose, then back at her dad and whispered, Mommy said we were leaving forever, but then we had to unpack everything really fast when you texted, and my heart plummeted to my shoes. Chet's face went from red to purple, and he grabbed Julianne by the throat with both hands. He lifted her off the ground and slammed her back against the living room wall so hard a picture frame fell and shattered. The kids started screaming and I jumped up to help, but Chet let go of Julianne and spun toward me with his fist pulled back. My whole body went cold because I knew he was about to hit me, but I couldn't just leave them. His fist stopped maybe 2 inches from my face and I could see every vein in his neck standing out. He told me to sit down and watch what happens to people who try to steal his family. He pointed at the couch and said if I moved again, he'd make sure I never walked out of this house. Oliver ran to me crying and buried his face in my shirt, while Mila stood frozen in the corner like a statue. I pulled Oliver onto my lap and held him tight while watching Chet grab Julianne by her hair. She was gasping and holding her throat where he'd choked her. He started dragging her down the hallway toward their bedroom, and she was trying to keep up but kept stumbling. She begged him to let the kids go to their rooms first, but he said they needed to see what happens when Mommy tells lies. Her feet were barely touching the ground as he pulled her along, and I felt Oliver shaking against me. I whispered that everything would be okay, even though I knew it wasn't true. The bedroom door slammed so hard the whole house shook, and then we heard Julianne cry out in pain. Something crashed and broke in there, and Chet's voice got louder and angrier. I told Mila to come sit with us, and she walked over slowly like she was sleepwalking. She climbed onto the couch and pressed against my other side, and both kids were holding on to me. I kept looking at the front door, trying to figure out if we could make it outside before Chet came back. Another crash came from the bedroom, and this time we heard glass breaking. Oliver started sobbing harder, and then I felt something warm and wet spreading on my lap. He'd wet himself and was crying even harder now because of it. Mila whispered that this was all her fault for telling Daddy the truth about packing. I told her firmly that none of this was her fault while listening for any sounds from outside. Maybe the neighbor had heard all the noise and would call for help. The bedroom went quiet suddenly, and that silence was worse than all the screaming. We sat there frozen and waiting, and then the door opened. Chet walked out, fixing his shirt and tucking it back into his pants. Julianne limped out behind him, holding her ribs with one arm, and her face was already swelling on one side. He said Mommy had something important to tell everyone and pushed her forward. Her voice came out shaky and quiet as she said she was sorry for trying to leave. Chet told her to say it louder so everyone could hear. She repeated that she was sorry, and promised it would never happen again. He made her say it a third time and then told the kids to go hug their mom and tell her they forgave her. Oliver didn't want to get up because of his wet pants, but Chet's face got dark again, so I helped him stand. The kids walked over to Julianne slowly and carefully like they were scared to touch her. She bent down painfully to hug them, and I saw her wince when Oliver pressed against her ribs. Someone knocked on the front door and Chet's whole body went stiff. He looked through the peephole and then turned back to us with his finger on his lips. He hissed that we better act normal or else, and then opened the door with a big fake smile on his face. The neighbor asked if everything was all right because she'd been hearing concerning noises for the past 20 minutes. Chet laughed and said the kids had just been playing too rough, and he'd had to settle them down. The neighbor tried to look past him into the house, and I tried to make eye contact with her. I wanted to scream for help, but Chet was standing where he could reach any of us in 2 steps. She looked right at me and then at Julianne, and I could see her taking in Julianne's swollen face. She said if she heard anything else, she was calling the police immediately, and then left. Chet closed the door and locked it, and his fake smile disappeared instantly. He started yelling that I'd ruined everything with my stupid looks at the neighbor. He said now the whole neighborhood would be talking about them and it was all my fault. He went to the kitchen and pulled out the biggest knife from the wooden block. He waved it around, saying maybe he should just end this whole thing right now since we destroyed his family anyway. Julianne stepped in front of the kids even though she could barely stand up straight. She told him to please put the knife down and that everything would be fine. He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh, and said nothing would ever be fine again because of what we'd done. The sound of sirens cut through his ranting, and Chet's whole body went rigid. He ran to the front window and pulled the curtain aside, and I could see the red and blue lights reflecting off his face. 2 police cars pulled into the driveway, and he spun around with his face twisted in rage and said we were all going to pay for this. The knife clattered onto the kitchen counter, and he pointed at each of us, telling us to shut up and let him handle everything. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely stand, but I grabbed Oliver's hand tight while Mila pressed against her mom. 3 hard knocks rattled the door, and a deep voice announced they were police doing a welfare check. Chet took a deep breath and smoothed his shirt down before opening the door with this fake, confused expression on his face. The officer's name tag said Miguel Cardenas, and his eyes went straight to Julianne's bloody nose and swollen face. Miguel asked if he could speak with her separately while his partner stayed with Chet in the doorway. Chet started saying everything was fine, but Miguel was already walking past him toward Julianne. I pulled Miguel aside and showed him the bruises already forming on my arms where Chet had grabbed me. I told him about the knife and how Chet found out we'd tried to leave, and Miguel's face got serious as he radioed for backup and child services. Julianne broke down crying and started telling him everything, while Miguel took photos of her injuries with his phone. Chet was getting louder with the other officer and kept trying to come back inside, but the officer blocked him. More police cars arrived, and suddenly Chet was turned around and handcuffed while he screamed that we were lying and he'd get custody of his kids. The children watched their dad get put in the police car, and Oliver buried his face in my shoulder while Mila just stared. Miguel told us an ambulance was coming and we'd be safe now, but I didn't believe him yet. The paramedics checked Julianne first and said she needed to go to the hospital for x-rays and observation. We all rode together in the ambulance with Julianne on the stretcher, and the kids clinging to me. At the emergency room, a nurse named Raina McCarthy took us to a private room and started documenting every bruise and cut on Julianne's body. She photographed the finger marks on her throat and the bald spots where hair had been pulled out, and explained these records would be important for court. Raina was gentle but thorough, and checked the kids too, even though their injuries were only emotional. A woman named Liliana Velez arrived and introduced herself as our domestic violence advocate. She had this calm way of talking and handed me a folder full of papers about protection orders and shelter options. Julianne could barely focus on what she was saying, so I took notes on everything about emergency housing and legal aid services. Liliana explained the criminal process and what would happen with Chet's arrest and charges. Another woman showed up and said she was Georgia Booth from Child Protective Services. She interviewed each of us separately about what happened today and what the kids had seen before. Georgia wasn't mean, but she made it clear that keeping the children safe was her main concern. She said she'd recommend services, but wouldn't remove the kids since Julianne was taking protective action by leaving. The doctor said Julianne needed to stay overnight for observation because she might have a concussion from hitting the wall. The shelter couldn't take us until morning anyway, so we all stayed at the hospital. I slept in the chair between the kids' hospital beds and jumped every time someone walked past our room. Mila woke up crying 3 times asking for her daddy, and I didn't know what to tell her. Oliver wet the bed and was so embarrassed, but the nurses were kind about it. In the morning, Liliana came back and drove us to the domestic violence shelter in an unmarked van. The building looked like a regular house from the outside with no signs or anything. The intake worker explained all the rules about keeping the location secret and not having any contact with abusers. Julianne signed papers with shaking hands while the kids looked around their new room with 2 sets of bunk beds. We'd been there maybe an hour when my phone started ringing nonstop. Ryan Westbrook, Chet's brother, left message after message saying Chet needed bail money, and this was all a big misunderstanding. I blocked his number, but he kept calling from different phones saying I was destroying their family, and I'd regret this. He said Chet was a good father and we were poisoning the kids against him. Liliana helped me document all the calls and save the voicemails for evidence. She set me up with a new phone number that afternoon, but somehow Ryan got that one too within a day. The harassment wouldn't stop, and I realized Chet's reach extended way beyond just him, even from inside a jail cell. 2 days later, my phone started blowing up with notifications, and I saw Chet had posted bail and was already on Facebook writing long posts about how Julianne was lying and turning his kids against him. He shared photos of them as a happy family from last Christmas, and wrote about parental alienation and false accusations ruining good fathers. People we both knew started commenting and taking sides, and some of them messaged me asking if it was true that Julianne was making it all up for custody. My old coworker Sarah texted saying Chet seemed like such a nice guy, and maybe Julianne was exaggerating, and I wanted to scream at how easily people believed his act. More messages kept coming, and some were really nasty, calling Julianne a liar and saying she was destroying an innocent man's life. The prosecutor called us to her office the next morning, and she looked tired with stacks of files covering her desk. She explained Chet was charged with assault, criminal threats, and child endangerment, but warned us these cases were hard to prove and could take months to get to trial. She showed us photos of Julianne's injuries and said the medical records would help, but without video evidence, juries sometimes didn't convict. She asked detailed questions about previous incidents and took notes while Julianne described years of abuse that had never been reported. The prosecutor said she'd do her best, but we could tell she'd seen too many of these cases go nowhere. That afternoon, Julianne tried to buy groceries with her debit card, but it was declined, and when she called the bank, they said the account was empty. Chet had withdrawn everything the morning before his arrest, and as the primary account holder, he had the legal right to do it. Her credit cards were all canceled too, and she had no access to any money except the $20 in her wallet. The shelter gave her vouchers for food and toiletries, but she cried in the bathroom afterward because she'd never had to take charity before. I gave her the $200 I had in my checking account, but we both knew it wouldn't last long. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Chet showed up with a lawyer in an expensive suit while Julianne had a legal aid attorney who'd met her 30 minutes before. Chet's lawyer stood up and said Julianne was mentally unstable and had coached the children to lie about their loving father. He had printed out text messages where Julianne had talked about being depressed years ago and tried to use them as proof she was unfit. The judge barely looked up from his papers as he granted Julianne temporary custody, but said Chet deserved supervised visitation with his children. Julianne grabbed my hand so hard it hurt and whispered that she thought the kids wouldn't have to see him after what he did. Her lawyer explained this was actually a good outcome because at least the visits would be supervised, but Julianne just stared at the floor. Georgia called to say she'd found a therapy program for the kids, but the wait list was 3 weeks because they needed specialists who worked with trauma. Oliver had started hitting other kids at the shelter and throwing things when he got frustrated, and the staff didn't know how to help him. Mila stopped talking almost completely and would just sit in the corner with a book pretending to read the same page over and over. The shelter workers tried their best, but they had 15 other families to deal with and couldn't give individual attention. We counted down the days until therapy could start and watched the kids get worse instead of better. The first supervised visit was scheduled at a family center downtown, and I drove them there with my stomach in knots. The supervisor was a young woman who looked bored and explained she'd be in the room, but couldn't interfere unless there were direct threats. Chet showed up with presents and immediately started telling the kids that mommy was sick in the head and trying to break up their family. The supervisor wrote something on her clipboard, but didn't stop him from saying mommy needed help and maybe had to go to a special hospital. When we picked them up 2 hours later, Mila was confused and kept asking if Julianne was going away to get better. Oliver had chocolate all over his face from the candy Chet brought and was bouncing off the walls from the sugar. The supervisor said she documented everything, but unless he made actual threats, she couldn't prevent him from talking to his own children. I went back to the house with 2 police officers to get important documents Julianne needed for the divorce lawyer. The place was destroyed with Julianne's clothes cut up and thrown everywhere, and the kids' favorite toys smashed to pieces. Chet had spray-painted words on the bedroom wall saying she'd never escape, and left printed photos of her taped to the mirror with her face scratched out. The officers took pictures and bagged some items for evidence, but said destruction of marital property during a separation was a civil matter, not criminal. We found Mila's special birthday dress in shreds, and Oliver's train set hammered into bits, and I had to leave the room to throw up. Julianne needed income, so she applied at a grocery store, but had to lie about her address since employers didn't like hiring people from shelters. She got the overnight stocking shift, which meant working 11 at night to 7 in the morning, so she could be with the kids during the day. Dark circles appeared under her eyes and she started falling asleep while the kids ate breakfast, but she said at least she was earning her own money. After 3 weeks at the shelter, another resident came up to Julianne holding her phone and showing Chet's Facebook posts with Julianne's picture. The woman said she could make good money telling Chet where his wife was hiding and started demanding cash to keep quiet. The shelter staff immediately started packing our things and said we had to leave within the hour for everyone's safety. The kids didn't understand why they had to pack again, and Oliver started crying about leaving his new friend from the playroom. We drove to another shelter 40 minutes away where nobody knew us and had to start the intake process all over again. In the new shelter, we met a woman with 3 kids who'd been there for 2 months after leaving her husband. Her kids played with Mila and Oliver in the common room, and for the first time in weeks, I saw them actually laugh at something. The mother sat with us at dinner and explained how she'd navigated the court system and what mistakes to avoid, and which judges were sympathetic to domestic violence cases. She showed Julianne how to document everything for custody hearings and gave her the name of a better legal aid lawyer. Her oldest daughter taught Mila a card game, and Oliver played with their youngest son, and it felt like maybe things could get better, even though we were far from done with this nightmare. The legal papers started arriving at the shelter 2 days later, and Julianne's hands shook opening each envelope. Chet's lawyer was demanding she submit to psychological evaluations, drug tests, parenting assessments, and wanted copies of all her medical records going back 5 years. The legal aid lawyer we'd been assigned looked exhausted when we met her, and had 3 other clients waiting in the lobby. She explained each response would cost money Julianne didn't have, and Chet knew this was how to break her down financially. We spent 4 hours filling out forms while the kids watched cartoons in the shelter's playroom, and I could see Julianne getting smaller with each document she signed. The supervised visitation started the next week at a family center downtown, and I drove Julianne and the kids there because she was shaking too hard to drive herself. When Chet arrived, he walked right up to Julianne during the exchange and leaned close enough that only she could hear him whisper something that made her face go white. She told me later he'd said he knew exactly where she worked and which route she took home, and she'd never escape him. The supervisor was checking her clipboard and missed the whole thing, but Julianne spent the rest of the day throwing up from fear. She talked about quitting her job, but we both knew she needed every dollar for the lawyer fees piling up. 3 weeks into our new routine, the kids finally got spots in the trauma therapy program, and I sat with Julianne in the waiting room during their first real session. The therapist came out after an hour with Mila, and her face was serious when she asked to speak with Julianne privately. I watched Oliver in the playroom while they talked, and when Julianne came back, she was sobbing so hard she couldn't speak. The therapist had discovered Mila had been having thoughts about hurting herself, because she believed she'd ruined everything by telling her dad about the escape attempt. They immediately started intensive treatment 3 times a week, and Oliver began talking for the first time about watching his dad hurt his mom. The stress was eating me alive, and I started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, waking up convinced Chet was breaking down my apartment door. My doctor referred me to a therapist who specialized in secondary trauma, and she helped me understand I was absorbing all of Julianne's fear on top of my own. She taught me breathing exercises and helped me see that I could support Julianne without destroying myself in the process. I started setting small boundaries like taking 1 evening a week for myself and not checking my phone every 5 minutes for crisis texts. 2 months after we'd escaped, the school called Julianne in a panic because Chet had shown up claiming there was a miscommunication about pickup time for Oliver. The secretary knew about the protection order and kept Oliver in the office while they called the police, but Chet left before they arrived. Julianne was terrified, but the prosecutor said this violation would strengthen the criminal case and showed his disregard for court orders. 6 weeks of shelter life finally ended when Julianne qualified for transitional housing through a program for domestic violence survivors. The apartment was small, but it had real locks and a security door, and the kids each got their own tiny bedroom. We spent a whole Saturday at thrift stores finding beds and dishes, and when Mila picked out purple curtains for her room, she smiled for real for the first time in months. Oliver decorated his walls with superhero posters we found at a garage sale and kept showing everyone who visited his new space. The criminal trial got scheduled for 3 months out, and the prosecutor met with us to prepare, warning that Chet's lawyer would attack Julianne's credibility and try to paint her as vindictive and unstable. We spent entire days going over testimony, reviewing photos of injuries, practicing staying calm under hostile questioning. Julianne stopped eating from stress, and I'd find her asleep at the kitchen table over legal documents at 3 a.m. Georgia came to check on the kids' progress and reported they were improving in therapy, but would need years of support to fully heal from what they'd witnessed. She recommended continuing the supervised visits despite Julianne begging her to stop them, because the court system favored maintaining parent relationships even with abusers. It felt like the system was choosing Chet's rights over the kids' safety, and Julianne cried for hours after that meeting. During one visit, Chet showed up with a woman he introduced to the kids as their new mommy, which made Mila cry and Oliver hide behind the supervisor. This violated the visitation rules about not introducing new partners, and his visits got suspended for 2 weeks, but he filed complaints claiming discrimination and demanding makeup time. The divorce lawyer Julianne finally saved enough to consult with sat us down and explained the harsh reality that even with documented abuse, Chet would probably get some form of custody eventually, unless he got convicted of serious felonies. The best-case scenario was supervised visits long-term, but full custody was unlikely to be permanently denied. Julianne's hope of ever being completely free from him shattered in that office, and I held her while she sobbed in the parking lot afterward. The next week, I found job training brochures at the community college and brought them to the apartment. We sat at her kitchen table filling out applications for dental assistant and medical assistant programs, while the kids watched cartoons. Julianne kept saying she wasn't smart enough, but I reminded her she'd gotten straight A's before dropping out to marry Chet. The medical assistant program offered childcare help and could be done in 9 months. She filled out the financial aid forms with shaking hands. 2 weeks later, the acceptance letter came and she actually smiled for the first time in months. The criminal trial date finally arrived 3 months later. I wore my only suit and sat in the witness chair trying not to shake. Chet's lawyer walked up to me asking if I hated his client. I said no. He asked if I'd been planning to help Julianne leave for months. I said I helped a friend in danger. He tried to make me look like I was breaking up a happy family, but I stuck to facts. I described finding Julianne with a black eye 6 months earlier. I told them about the knife threat. I explained how Chet had grabbed Mila and shaken her. The prosecutor showed photos of Julianne's bruised throat and asked me to identify who was in the room. Julianne took the stand next and could barely speak through her tears. She described years of being hit and choked and threatened. She showed the jury scars on her arms from when he'd thrown her into a glass table. The kids' therapist testified without them having to appear. She explained their drawings showed violence and their play therapy involved daddy hurting mommy. She said both children showed signs of trauma. Chet sat there in his suit looking calm like none of this was real. The jury came back after 4 hours. They found him guilty of assault and making criminal threats. But they said not guilty on child endangerment because he hadn't directly hurt the kids. The judge gave him 2 years probation and ordered anger management classes. Julianne started crying because she thought he'd go to jail. I held her hand and reminded her this conviction would help with custody. Her divorce lawyer used the criminal conviction to argue for sole custody at the next hearing. The judge agreed Chet could only have supervised visits at a court facility. He had to pay $600 a month in child support and take parenting classes. It wasn't perfect, but it meant legal protection. Julianne started her medical assistant classes the next month. I picked up the kids from their new school 3 days a week while she was in class. Oliver's teacher knew about their situation and watched for problems. Mila made a friend named Sophie who invited her to a birthday party. It was her first normal kid thing in forever. Oliver joined the after-school art program and started drawing happy pictures instead of scary ones. Julianne studied at night after putting them to bed, and I helped her practice taking blood pressure. She was good at the medical stuff and her teachers noticed. The program was hard, but she never missed a class. 6 months after that terrible day, Chet's probation officer called Julianne. He'd been caught driving past her apartment building 3 times in 1 week. The protection order said he couldn't come within 500 feet. His probation got revoked and the judge gave him 60 days in county jail. We could finally breathe without checking over our shoulders constantly. During those 2 months, Ryan stopped calling and texting threats. Some people who'd believed Chet's lies on social media started reaching out to apologize. Julianne was careful, but let a few old friends back in slowly. The kids went to therapy twice a week and started getting better. Oliver stopped having tantrums where he'd hit things and break toys. Mila started talking about her feelings instead of hiding in her room. Their therapist said they were strong kids who would keep healing with time and support. They graduated to once-a-week sessions after 6 months. Julianne finished her program with the highest grades in her class. She applied to 5 clinics and got 3 interviews. The pediatric clinic offered her full-time with health insurance and normal Monday through Friday hours. When she got her first real paycheck, she cried in the car. It was enough for rent and food without begging anyone for help. She bought the kids new shoes that actually fit. When Chet got out of jail, he had to use a special center for his visits. He had to pay the supervisor $50 an hour himself. He showed up for the first visit late and angry about the rules. The second visit, he canceled an hour before. By the 4th month, he was only coming once a month. The kids stopped asking when they'd see Daddy. They stopped tensing up when the doorbell rang. Life started feeling almost normal sometimes. A year after that first escape attempt, Julianne found a 2-bedroom apartment in a better part of town near good schools. The landlord ran her credit and asked about the protection order but approved her anyway. We spent a whole weekend painting the kids' rooms with colors they picked out themselves. Mila chose purple for her walls and hung up drawings from art class and photos of her new friends from the school. Oliver covered his walls with superhero posters and put his baseball trophies on a shelf Julianne built from a kit. The apartment had a real kitchen with a dishwasher and windows that actually locked properly. Julianne bought furniture piece by piece from thrift stores and garage sales until it looked like a real home. The neighbors were families with kids who played outside without fear. Around that same time, I realized I'd been putting my whole life on hold for almost 2 years. My own apartment was basically just a place to sleep between helping Julianne with everything. A guy from my gym asked me out and I said no automatically before realizing I didn't have a real reason. Julianne noticed me turning down invitations and sat me down one night after the kids were asleep. She told me I'd saved her life, but now I needed to save my own. She was right and I knew it, but felt guilty about wanting normal things while they were still healing. I started going on dates with the gym guy who turned out to be patient and understanding about my weird schedule. He never pushed when I canceled plans to help with court stuff or kid emergencies. Julianne started pushing me to do things for myself like taking that art class I'd been talking about forever. Our friendship changed from crisis mode to something healthier, where we could just watch movies and laugh. 3 months later, we got a call from the prosecutor's office with shocking news. Chet had been arrested again for beating up his new girlfriend at her apartment. The woman had defensive wounds and neighbors had called 911 when they heard screaming and things breaking. This time he was facing real prison as a repeat offender with a prior conviction. The prosecutor said with his history, the judge would take it seriously this time. Julianne threw up after the call because even hearing his name still made her sick. But there was also relief that someone else had reported him and created more evidence of his pattern. His new girlfriend reached out through the prosecutor wanting to talk to Julianne about what she'd survived. They met at a coffee shop and the woman cried hearing Julianne's story matched her experience exactly. The woman testified at his trial about how the abuse escalated just like Julianne had described. With 2 victims and his probation violations, Chet got 18 months in state prison. During his time locked up, he missed every scheduled call with the kids and didn't complete any required parenting programs. The family court judge reviewed his case and found he'd abandoned his parental responsibilities. His rights were terminated after a hearing where he didn't even show up to fight it. The kids didn't have to worry about visits anymore or wonder when he might appear. Oliver stopped asking about his dad completely, and Mila stopped having nightmares about him finding them. The constant checking over shoulders and jumping at doorbells finally started to fade. Julianne's supervisor at the clinic noticed her dedication and promoted her to lead medical assistant with a real salary. She opened a savings account for the first time in years and started putting money away for the kids' college. Every deposit felt like proof she could build something permanent without someone controlling her money. She joined a support group at the Women's Center, and after 6 months became a mentor for new members. Women would call her crying, and she'd talk them through safety planning and court procedures she knew by heart. Her confidence grew with each person she helped find their own path to freedom. 2 years after that terrifying day when Chet caught us trying to leave, everything was different. Mila tested into the gifted program at Thea School and spent hours reading chapter books in her purple room. Oliver made the Little League team and practiced batting in the apartment parking lot every evening. They still went to therapy once a month but mostly talked about regular kid stuff now. Their laughter filled the apartment when they played together without the edge of fear underneath. Julianne had started talking to a man from her support group who'd lost custody fighting his abusive ex-wife. He understood why she flinched at sudden movements and never questioned her need for independence. He brought takeout on Friday nights and helped Oliver with his batting stance in the parking lot. The kids liked him because he made their mom smile and never raised his voice even when Oliver broke his car window with a baseball. Mila told me she wasn't scared of him, which felt like the highest endorsement possible. Looking back at everything, that failed escape led us through systems I never knew existed. We found advocates and lawyers and therapists who actually understood trauma and didn't judge. Julianne and the kids weren't just safe now, but actually happy most days. They built a life with birthday parties and school plays and bedtime stories without fear. We survived what felt impossible and came out stronger on the other side. Thanks for hanging out and exploring all this with me today. Really was fascinating diving into those questions together. Until next time, friends, take it easy. Like the video, it helps more than you think.